especially as our inclusion chairs. They put in a lot of effort. So this morning we're honored to welcome our 4 distinguished panelists. For me, this is an opportunity to not only listen and to learn from these individuals, but I do it with a lot of joy and with the understanding of the responsibility that all of us have to learn these lessons and to gain their knowledge so that we can pass it on as well, right? So without further ado, Miles is going to take it away. Ready?
Yep.
All right, sir.
All right, once again, I really do appreciate y'all coming out. We weren't able to have one of the guests, but so far we have Miss Darlene Blackburn. She was a legendary culture icon in Chicago, a founding member of the Afroart Theater movement in the 1960s, and internationally known African dancer, teacher, and activist. Also, we have Dr. Jabulani Makalani, noted author, scholar, professor. He has published wide varieties of areas in African American studies and sociology. Also, we have Master Yirser Hotep, founder of the global Kemetic yoga movement, world-renowned teacher, writer, scholar, social worker, activist, and former DePaul University professor for the African American history and health and wellness. And then lastly, we have Dr. Michael Brown, Bronzeville historian, former editor of the Chicago Daily Defender newspaper, author, former audio, radio talk host, as well as an activist and social reformer and child psychologist. And for this, we have a few questions that you guys can chime in if you have any questions for them. But the first question is, why is it important for people to know and understand their history? And at what point in time should we begin to study the African American history?
Okay, well, I'm sure my colleagues have a lot to say about that, but let me try to answer that question by giving you some of my experience, because I was fortunate enough to grow up in the Black community, and so a lot of things about Black history and Black culture I experienced because later on I began to understand that this history was being made in the very community in which I lived. I didn't know that at the time because I could go around the corner and go to different Black-owned businesses, and I didn't know that was sort of like a novelty. That I didn't understand that Black people had been kept out of different areas of endeavor, and so when I found these things in my own community, I thought that was normal. And it was later on when I went to college and I realized that the experiences I had were very rich experiences, that I began to appreciate it more and more. And I encountered people who knew so much about history, Black history and culture, that it motivated me. That the summer that I went to college, I decided that I was also involved in a number of activist activities at my university, for example, and so I was very motivated to learn. That summer, I read about 25 books on Black history and culture, and I taught my first class on African American history, and I was in 1968, and I was 18 at the time. And from then on, I committed myself to learning and reading about Black history and culture. And later on, I would teach in the field and do that for well over 40 years. Now, what I encourage you to do and why learning that history is important is because it helps you to understand how we arrived at where we are today. And for example, when you look at a Black community, if you see a depressed community, the question is why. You cannot determine why unless you know the history behind how that community came into existence. Right? And I think that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, how certain communities in Chicago came into existence. There was a mention of Bronzeville, and there are other historic Black communities. How institutions came into existence, how certain art forms came into existence. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, enjoy hip hop, but something came before hip hop, as I'm sure you know. And hip hop stands on the shoulders of those cultural expressions that evolved and emerged from the black community. And not only from black urban communities, but from the very period that black people came and were brought into this culture, this hemisphere, and as enslaved individuals, as they developed these art forms that primarily had roots in Africa, developed them in plantation life as they were enslaved, and were copied by Europeans and became prominent in terms of popular culture in American society. So to understand that, we have to study.
Well, in addition to what Brother Dr. Jabulani Makalani, he was my professor when I was in my I was in my late teens when I met him. He was one of my professors when I was in my early stage of going to college. And so what I would say in addition to what he's saying is that we need to also go into the ancient past. We need to understand the evolution from ancient Africa to the present and how we got to where we are. Right now, there is a concerted effort among certain people to deny the truth of our history, to deny the greatness of our history, to deny that we even come from a place called Africa, you know. And so, you know, we have to educate ourselves to have a realistic understanding of history and who we are, so that we are able to not be deceived by some of these efforts that are going on by people who are, you could say, enemies of progress and of diversity and of equality, okay, and enemies of people really having human rights. So, so for me, I went into the past. I went into ancient Africa, into ancient Egypt, which is called Kemet, and you know, I wanted to really know who are we from the beginning, you know, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, up until the present. We have a very rich history that goes back not only hundreds of years, but also goes back many thousands, tens of thousands of years. And understanding that really informs us and gives us a really greater perspective about who we are and what our greatness is. When we think about the fact that we built pyramids, that we built great temples that still stand now, that when we understand that our forms of cultural expression have their roots in Africa, that when you travel to Africa and you see people who look and act exactly like you, except they have maybe a different language, but when you look at them, you can't even tell the difference. You know, that informs you a lot.
It's so true. Because my first trip to Ghana was in 1969. I went to Ghana, West Africa. And dance movements that I saw there was looking like the dance movements that I had done here in America. In fact, I jumped up on the stage and I said, I could do that. They're just doing social dances, mashed potatoes, and Uncle Willie. And they were just shocked. They were shocked that they thought that, you know, that you can do our movements, but I was calling myself doing my movements, my social dance movements, because I came out as a social dancer. And so when I came back in 1969, I choreographed a dance called From Africa to America. Just from that, and tried to show that relationship of the dances that we do socially here and the traditional dances that they do there. And because as I told my students, we just have amnesia. We just don't know that we're doing African movements. We're not conscious that a lot of the movements that we do socially come out of Africa.
I think that for me, I learned as a kid the importance of being who you are, understanding who you are. I think for any race of people, any ethnicity, and any religion, that you understand the beginning of and why. As a child, my father had a business, and I'm 2 days older than dirt, and I was around when they made water. And so, my first job as 8 years old was going to Highland Park, Wilmette, Kenilworth, Glencoe, cleaning European American houses, cleaning toilets, making beds, cleaning kitchens. When I got 16, I had my own crew. But however, during that time, my grandfather, my grandparents, my mom was always teaching me the importance of being an African American. I was involved in, you all wouldn't know this, but the store called A&P was like a jewel. As a kid, I was protesting. My mom had me with my wagon protesting to shut down with Operation Breadbasket, shut down A&P because they weren't doing good in our neighborhood. They weren't treating us fair. So as a child, when I was a kid, I'm the youngest of 9 children. I had 5 sisters. I've never seen a white doll in my house. I've never seen a white Santa Claus. My mom would purchase white dolls for my sister, but she'd always paint them brown. And that sent a significant message to me. Am I making sense here? So regardless of what race you are or wherever you come from, if you understand who you are and what you are, that's very important, but you have to understand your history. And I was taught that from a child about who I am, where I came from, and what is important. And I learned from Dr. John Henry Clark. It's not just black history, it's history. And if you take history and understand what that is, then everyone has its place in history, as nothing happens in a vacuum. That's why you should study history.
I'd like to just piggyback on something that Brother Yirser said. The name of this book is The End of Black Studies. Now, I brought a few things, show and tell. And what that means is, what is the purpose of Black Studies? When we talk about what is the end of Black Studies, what is the purpose of Black Studies? But it also has another meaning. It means what is impeding our understanding of the Black experience. Right? Just as Brother Yirser pointed out, that there are people who are making a conscious effort to distort our history. And he talks about the importance of beginning from the very beginning. Right? And if we understand that history, we understand it's the history of humankind. And so we have to start from the very beginning to understand how we got to this point where we are today. So that if you were to read this, you would understand what is the purpose of understanding that historical experience called the Black experience, and what are the things that are impeding our understanding of that, what distorts our understanding of that. And most of us are born, because we're born into our present, whatever our present is, we don't understand what happens in the past. We don't understand how we got here. For example, if I were to ask you, what was the system of etiquette, of social etiquette, imposed upon Black people historically in this country? And could you tell me that, well, when you were growing up in the South, you couldn't look a white man in the eyes? You would have to call all white people Mr. or Mrs., even if they were kids. If you didn't call them Miss, you call them Master. Right? You had to step off the curb to let white people by. That you could never enter an establishment through the front door. You had to come through the back door. You couldn't eat or sleep in the same place as white people. When you rode trains, if they allowed you on the same car, they would pull a curtain and you would have to stay behind that curtain if you wanted to eat. Or you would have to wait till all white people ate before you came in. Or if you were trying to buy a movie ticket, you would have to wait till everybody, all white people bought their tickets and then you could buy yours. And then you would have to sit in the balcony. And they had a name for that. I won't call that name, but they had a name where you had to sit. And if you looked down and you saw any black people on the first floor, why were they allowed to sit there? Because they were caring for white children. That there was separate everything, separate phone books, separate cemeteries. And we could go on and on and on and on in terms of how black people were made inferior in the context of every aspect of their lives, including the destruction of their historical memory. And so we had to take it upon ourselves to resurrect that memory. That's why you had Carter G. Woodson create Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. Unfortunately, we still don't learn any Black history during Black History Month, right? Just like we don't know what Martin Luther King, people say, well, what, you know anything about, yeah, he had a dream. What was that dream? Because we don't know what the dream was because we don't know what black people went through. And so we have to learn that, we have to study that. And this very day, we still have people, and you read about them every day, who are trying to keep anybody from learning the history of black people. We know what's going on in Florida and other places in the country right now. Because not only they don't want anybody to know that history, not just black people, but all people. They don't want them to know that history because they want to be able to say black people are in this position because they're inferior, or it's not really that bad. But you have to study to understand what that condition is, what the plight has been, and also what black people have contributed to the well-being of this country and to the world.
And I know we have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to add a little bit more to this, is that when you study African pre-colonial, pre-enslavement history, in Africa, we had cities that were far larger, far more sophisticated, far more organized than anything that existed in Europe, okay? These cities were very well ordered and, you know, had very structured social systems and so on and so forth. And those cities were systematically destroyed. And in order to create and perpetuate a myth that black people were inferior and that we did not have writing, we did not have building, that we was living in huts and so on and so forth, okay? We had sewage systems, we had running water, so on and so forth. So you need to read your history, you need to go back into your history. We can give you a list of different authors that you can read, including my brother here, his books that he's written. He's been extensively on these things. And, you know, you need to learn, you know, who we were pre-enslavement, pre-colonial, and then even after we were enslaved and we came out of slavery. We came out of slavery because we fought, not because Abraham Lincoln did an Emancipation Proclamation. 100 to 200,000 black people joined the Union Army to defeat slavery. And then we built cities on our own cities that were also systematically destroyed. So if you never heard the term Black Wall Street, think about that. Tulsa, Oklahoma, think about that. And you can name scores of cities like Tulsa, like Black Wall Street, that were destroyed, you know, in order to put us in the place that we are in now.
Yes, sir. So I was hearing a lot of you guys talk about how our history has led to where we're at today. So because of things like the Great Migration, when people have came from down south and came up north, what are some ways those things have had an effect on Chicago? And what is an example of just some of those different things? And can you describe to us Bronzeville and how that name came?
Well, when you talk, we'll get into that too, but let's talk about the first, before the Bronx, talk about the Great Migration.
Yes, sir.
There's lots of different time frames from 1916 to 1970, from 1920, whatever, but the Great Migration was a process, was a term given by the newspapers. And it was for a mass movement of African Americans moving from the southern states to the northern states like Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, etc. However, because of greater opportunities of work, employment, and socialization to escape the racism and the Jim Crow laws of the South. And when you talk about the movement, how did folks get here? Well, first of all, they came by train, by walking, etc. But most of the knowledge or information of the Great Migration was sent via the newspapers. The story goes that the Chicago Defender, the Philadelphia Inquirer, these papers were providing information for the people in the South to say, hey, look, you have better opportunities, less discrimination if you come up to Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. And how that information was passed through, and you've probably heard this, and it came on by the trains, the Pullman Porters. The Pullman Porters, the trains went to the South, right here, stopped up here at 12th Street, where folks would come up to Chicago from the South. And the Pullman Porters would take the newspapers. It was illegal to read the Chicago Defender and other black newspapers. It was illegal for the African Americans in the South to read newspapers that told them to leave the South. If you got caught reading newspapers, you could be killed. Just that simple. And so they came to Chicago and these large cities up north to escape that kind of problems in the South. And that was the purpose of the Great Migration. Tons of folks came up here, and that also began another problem of racism. Because when we became from the South, now we began to compete with the European Americans for the jobs, especially at the stockyards over here on Halsted and the steel mills. So that we began to compete for those jobs, which is another part of racism I can maybe talk about later, of how I believe racism really started, was a whole economic process. But when we came from the South, we also went to those stockyards, went to those steel mills, went to those factories, and said, hey, look, we want jobs too.
Let me just add a little bit to that. The Great Migration there were certain push and pull factors. What pushed black people out of the South, or large numbers of black people out of the South, would pull them to the North. And some of the pull factors were around a couple of things. One is industrialization. And that meant that there were more jobs that were being created as an industry expanded. Part of that industrialization was being spawned by World War I. So industry was expanding and it needed greater labor. And in the past, those positions in industry were being filled by European immigrants. At one time, you had about a million European immigrants being brought over here every year. When the war cut off that migration, that movement of European immigrants, there was a tremendous labor shortage. And so now you had opportunity, and there were labor recruiters that went into the South to try to get blacks to come. Now you could be arrested for doing that, but nonetheless they did that. In the South, of course, you had the Jim Crow laws, the violence. There were thousands of lynchings that occurred in the South. And lynchings meant that you could be killed, and that was the punishment, for committing some, quote, crime, and without due process. So lynching is really when you are being punished without due process, right? So if you were suspected or it was said, okay, you were disrespectful to white folks, or you, quote, raped a white woman, or you did something that they claimed that you did, you could be lynched. And lynching didn't just mean hanging, it meant that you could be burned alive. Many were burned alive. You could be mutilated, drugged through the streets, tarred and feathered. There are all these methods of punishment, right? So black people wanted to get away from that. They wanted to get so that was a push factor. Also, you had a decline in the economy in the South. What's the bug that ate cotton? Boll weevil, thank you very much. The boll weevil infestation that impacted the cotton industry in the South. And so, again, even though black folks were pretty poor, things were even worse in the South. So those are the push factors. And then you had the pull factors to get those jobs that were emerging in the urban areas in the North. And as my colleague pointed out, the Chicago Defender and other newspapers were critical in informing black people in the South what was available in the North, that you could come and get these kinds of jobs. And in fact, you were oftentimes coming into neighborhoods that were not defined by Jim Crow laws, that they were actually integrated neighborhoods, until of course you had large numbers of blacks coming, and then you had what they call white flight. Whites began to leave. And then of course, at the fringe of these movements of blacks into white neighborhoods, you had bombings. So a lot of the bombings occurred against the blacks who were most well off, because they were the ones who could afford to move into these neighborhoods, like Robert Abbott, who founded the Chicago Defender. People like him had their homes burned and bombed because they were moving into areas that were where black people were not wanted.
I think that to fast forward to that is when you've heard Dr. Martin Luther King, right? He came to Chicago, and he came to Chicago after, what did he say? Chicago was one of the what?
He said, I've been to Selma, I've been to Montgomery. He said, I've been to all these different southern places. He said, I've never experienced the level of racism that I did in Chicago. And they bust him in the head with a brick.
He's never been hit in the head with a brick. And I remember that as a kid. I remember that march. I was going to that march at that time. And for whatever reason, I didn't make it over on 67th Street in Marquette Park. And then the word came that folks had attacked him and hit him in the head. So then we all started running over that way. But racism and the migration was one of the things that brought, I would guess, the racism to light in Chicago, and really painted a picture differently, because folks thought that segregation and racism was only down south. But when we started moving north, it became very aware that it was here too, because Chicago was and still is one of the most segregated cities in this country. When you look at the stratification of neighborhoods in Chicago, some of you are from Chicago, some of you aren't. There's certain places, there's black neighborhoods, there's white ethnic neighborhoods, there's European neighborhoods, etc. And that was by design in Chicago and other cities.
Chicago is said to be the most segregated city on the planet Earth.
It is.
And that is the truth.
As a kid, as I lived on 48th and Champlain. As a child, I could not cross Drexel Avenue. As a kid, I wanted to go play basketball across 3 blocks away. The police would tell me, go back, you can't come over here.
Where I lived on the south, where I lived, which is on 18th and Wabash, they call it the South Loop now. Everybody wants to live there because everything is condos and stuff. When I first moved there in the 1950s, right? If you cross the street on Wabash, if you lived black people lived on the west side of the street, white people lived on the east side of the street. My grandparents had a restaurant where only black people ate. Across the street, right from their restaurant, was a white restaurant that only white people ate. And if you cross the street to go over to their side of the street, you would get beat up. If they crossed the street over to our side of the street, they would get beat up. And that's how it was for a long time. And even, you know, and I know y'all athletes, when I played in high school, it was like every time we played, I went to all black high school. When we played a white school, it was like a war. Every time we played a white school, there was a big fight at the end of the game.
Always.
Yes, sir. And y'all talked about how there were different communities, so could you touch on possibly what Bronzeville was and where that name came from?
Well, can I start? Sure. Bronzeville was let me just give you the geographic. Some of you may in Chicago. Bronzeville, first of all, used to be called Negro Town. A guy named James Gentry, I think, who was was one of the editors of the Chicago Bee newspaper, changed that term to Bronzeville. And why he changed that is a lot of different stories. But the geographical location of Bronzeville, and this is where you know what the Dan Ryan Expressway is? All those used to be black houses, by the way, those black folks' homes there. Bronzeville from 26th Street, if you will, on the north, to 63rd Street on the south, Cottage Grove on the east, and the expressway, which was railroad trains, on the west. That was Bronzeville. That was the concentration of where African Americans lived on the south side of Chicago. It was similar on the west side. Bronzeville had in it the various pillars of the community, from business to dance to music, to hospital, private hospital. All these were located in Bronzeville. If you name a person of major significance in any field, mostly out of Chicago, came out of Bronzeville. Would you agree? You know, Anthony Overton was a medical professor. A school's named after him. The Bee newspaper, Chicago Defender newspaper. When you look at Private Hospital, Dr. Daniel Hell Williams, out of Bronzeville. Nat King Cole, Duke Ellington, Phillips High School. We had two, for instance, Phillips High School was located. How many of you know of Phillips High School in Chicago? On 39th Street. Phillips High School was the only high school in South Side black folks could go to. It was erected by Rosenwald. The Rosenwald building was on 47th Street, Wabash, Michigan. It's a big building. Rosenwald and Rockefeller helped build that high school. And then that's where most of your famous athletes came from, Phillips High School. Then Phillips High School got so large, population-wise, they had built DuSable High School, which where all the other track stars and basketball stars came from on Chicago's south side. Crane been on the west side. But Bronzeville itself was the mecca, if you will, I would say even the incubator for African Americans in Chicago. And then after years of success, if you will, we use that term success, then we began to go into Beverly, etc., when that space began to open up for African Americans, primarily African Americans. In Bronzeville itself, you had, you name it, it was there when it came to education. DuSable High School, Phillips High School, we had a few, you said you was on 52nd Street, right? Before Warren, you had the high school right there on 50-something, 53rd and King Drive. Brook, that was right there, 52nd King Drive, the grammar school there. That was one of the main high schools that African Americans could go to. So it was very segregated, but it was very progressive. Most of the schools and most of the businesses were owned by African Americans in Bronzeville. And there's a statue, you may have seen it, in Chicago on 26th and is it King Drive? The statue, it's called the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. It was an African American sculpture, female sculptors and artists. And the statue is facing north, right by McCormick Place. The statue is orientated north with the hands raised up. It's a man carrying a suitcase. Mm-hmm. Now, that statue gives the story of Bronzeville when you just look at it. Telling people it's coming north. to Chicago. And the statues, and you'll see statues and suitcases all around there. That's because people brought all their stuff up here. But also, you would look at it, it looks like it's feathers on the statue. Those are soles of shoes of all the people who came north to Chicago to get a better life. Oh, Burke School, that's the name of it. Burke School was one of the main African-American schools on Chicago South Side.
If I can just add a little bit more to that. Bronzeville is like a lot of black communities, or most black communities in the north or in urban areas, that they were forced into being segregated because of a system of white supremacy. So blacks lived in confined areas, and there was class integration. That is, poor black people, middle-class black people, and so-called upper-class black people all lived in the same geographical area. And so that all the kinds of businesses that black people needed were in that community. So you didn't, and that wasn't necessarily, there were positives to that in the sense that we did have businesses in the black community at that time. We don't have any, or very few now, because commercial integration, right, has eliminated those businesses. And I use the word integration loosely because what it means is that black people have to leave their community to get everything they need. Right? Before, you could get everything you needed, or most things that you needed within your community, even though blacks may not have owned those businesses. But in terms of Chicago, you have what was called the Black Belt. The Black Belt started around 26th Street and extended to about 39th Street. That's where, in that geographical area, about 90% of all black people who lived in Chicago lived in that area. And you identified the east and west boundaries, roughly the railroad tracks to the west and Cottage Grove to the east. And but the black migration continued, and movement of blacks continued southward, and so that community was expanded. But that Black Belt became Bronzeville, and it was named in the process that was just described. That you had an editor who was with the Chicago Bee that was published by Anthony Overton, the first black man to create a business conglomerate. And so the Bee was that paper, and this particular editor came over to the Chicago Defender, and he brought the name Bronzeville with him. And they had annually a Mayor of Bronzeville event. And it was part of how that community developed and evolved, because it was a community, and that was the positive about it. You had businesses, you had a lot of black-owned businesses, you had organizations. One of the critical organizations for black people began in 1902, and that was the Musicians Union. And if you were a musician, a black musician, or if you were just a musician of any ilk, you could make a lot of money. That was really a middle-class profession, because you could not work without being a member of the union, and the union demanded that you have command a certain salary. And understand, you didn't have any type of electronics where people could play music that was of any significance. You had to have live music. And this was extremely important for the black community, because who was bringing the music that everybody was copying? African Americans. And so black musicians were in demand to play that music, but they could also play all kinds of music. So the Musicians Union was a critical organization for black people from the very beginning, and it was a segregated union because blacks couldn't join the white union. So they had their own union, but they still were able to command the same or similar salaries as white musicians. And so that area that I mentioned between 26th Street and 39th Street, the main commercial district was on State Street. Most of you are familiar with State Street, I'm sure. State Street. And that was the first important commercial center in the black community in Chicago. You had at least 9 or 10 theaters.
Yeah, the bank, the Binger Bank.
You had the Binger Bank, you had the Douglas Bank.
Yeah.
Those two banks in 1929 controlled 36% of all black banking assets in the country. So these were the two most, the largest financial institutions, banking institutions in the country. So you also had people who sold clothing. You had all kinds of jobs in that little strip between 26th Street and 39th Street, including the Pekin Theater, which was the first black-owned theater of any significance in this country. Right? So this was an important period. You had, again, all kinds of people in real estate who lived.
The DeJarnette brothers had major real estate.
And many others, but 39th Street, between 39th and 26th Street, on State Street, was a critical commercial area for black people in this country. And of course, for the incubation of that music, the new music of the time that was being called jazz. Right? And understand that jazz was not we may look at it as a listening music, but it was the popular music of the time. And you had two things that came together: the music and the dance. And jazz and dance, popular dances, were emerging from these areas and were a principal mode of business for African Americans at that time.
Could we, I don't know if it's proper for us to digress, but could we ask, because of time, could we see if there's some questions that the folks want to ask us?
Yes, sir. I was actually going to ask Ms. Blackburn a question about the Afroart Theater that you guys talked about. Can you tell us about that and some of the significant people and groups that came from it?
Yes, but I think what people miss in talking about the Afroart Theater, which was started in 1968. 1967, we were on the beach, 63rd Street beach. That's very significant. We were teaching dance, music, workshops on the beach, free. 63rd Street beach. And then in the evening, we would do performances. This became so popular because people were just out on the beach, right? And so they would hear the music and they would just come. We had huge crowds of people coming every week. And that popularity of that, when the fall hit, that was why we had to move something to an inside place. Because we had that type of following that they wanted to keep this going. And we came together, a group of us came together, and Phil Coran is really the founder of the Afroart Theater. He suggested to the group, well, then you have to help us, we need a theater. And so we all came together and started looking around for theaters. We had been performing in a lot of theaters, like, I don't know any of them, but anyway, on the south side, on like 63rd Woodline Theater, and then there was the South Town Show Theater, and we had been performing at all these different places. But the only one that was we were able to get was the Afroart Theater, which we named it that. But it was the Oakland Theater on 39th and Drexel.
Yep.
And that's where we put together and Phil Coran named it the Afroart Theater, AFFRO, from out of Africa. And from the beginning like that, we had our local artists that were superb. You know, we had people like, I don't know if you heard of him, but anyway, Cora, Harold Johnson, who was a theater person, and he was doing programs out of there also. Then we would have people that came from out of town. I know you should have heard of Olatunji from Nigeria. He brought his dance company there, you know, which is fabulous to us. And once Sammy Davis Jr. saw what we was doing, he wanted to be a part of it too, and he donated a lot of money, and a lot of people don't know that, but Sammy Davis Jr. donated a lot of money to the Afroart Theater, you know. Now, after we became, I have to keep saying that, became so popular, other activists wanted to have their meetings and stuff there, like Stokely Carmichael, you know, Kwame Ture. And then Leroy Jones, what's his name?
Amiri Baraka.
They came in and they wanted to use the theater. So with all of this happening at that time, we still wanted to keep it going, but I remember personally being there performing, and Leroy Jones at that time said some things that we were not in agreement with. You know, but when they say they just, you know, when those kind of speakers get up, they can say anything they want to. We don't know what they're gonna say. But the things that he said really is what got the theater closed down. Then it was the whole problem also is that Stokely Carmichael, when he came, he didn't want all the photographers and stuff in there, so he asked for, again, for no photographers. Then again, we got closed down. I mean, they use other excuses like, you know, fire hazards and all those, but we all know that it wasn't for none of those reasons. It was the people that we were having, that were speaking against a lot of things that were happening at that time. So we got closed down, and Brother Philip put on the billboard, "Closed by deceit," and that's really how we closed down from that era right there, 1968, 69, and went into something else.
Let me add something too, because one, I want to tell you the feeling of the Afroart Theater, and the significance of it, and also some of the things, great things you contributed to that theater. The Afroart Theater was important in galvanizing, bringing Black people together during the period of what they call the Black Consciousness, Black Arts movement. Right? So it helped to change the consciousness of Black people. It changed the way they thought about themselves, right? Rather than thinking about yourself as inferior, you begin to think about your connection to your history and culture, and making a conscious effort to elevate yourself, to be better than what you were. Right? And the Afroart Theater had classes to do that. It had taught you about your history. It taught you how to eat, taught you about your health, right? And the music lifted you up. And the concept of music that Phil Coran brought, he brought a unique sound. And unfortunately, we don't have an example of that sound. But some of you are familiar with maybe Earth, Wind, and Fire, and you heard something called the kalimba, or the song, the kalimba, the thumb piano. Well, Maurice White got that from Phil Coran. He attempted to recreate that sound. He didn't do it, but he had tried to, because he used to listen to Phil play. These are Chicago musicians. And other musicians who played with Phil became part of Earth, Wind, and Fire. There was this brother named Fifi. Did you know Fifi?
I don't know.
He was a brother that he played the conga drums and you see his name on one of the first albums that Earth, Wind, and Fire put out. And I remember seeing the brother at the bus stop, and he said, "Man, they're trying to steal Phil's," because he played with Earth, Wind, and Fire. He said they're trying to steal Phil's sound, right? And he no longer played with the group, and that's exactly one of the great influences that Phil Coran had on other people, on Earth, Wind, and Fire, and other groups, right, as well.
Curtis Mayfield.
Curtis Mayfield, and the group that was with Phil became the Pharaohs, and they gave Shaka Khan her name, right? So they had an impact on a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. When I went to the Afroart Theater and heard Phil, it was hypnotic, and Darlene, as a dancer, when she would dance to that music, I guarantee you it was mesmerizing. And the sister won't admit it, but she was unbelievable. And she was very important in creating that consciousness and lifting black people up. Anybody who came into that theater, you were lifted up.
When I went there, I'm gonna say this, when I went there in 1960, 86, something like that, because I lived down the street, I used to go there when it was a movie theater. And when you walked in, you would go to the concession stand. They had carrot juice, they had veggie burgers, they had bean pie, they had all this, everything was about health. So everybody that's like into healthy foods today, they owe it, going back to Phil Coran, Afroart Theater, but also Albina Fulton in Chicago, who taught Dick Gregory, and she taught most of the people who became vegetarians or health gurus and so on and so forth. That's a whole nother story.
Yes, sir. So we're gonna take a quick 5-minute break, allow you guys to stretch, and then when we come back, we'll do a small group discussion and allow you guys to ask questions.